How do you fight when you can't walk, can't run, and are surrounded by enemy soldiers? In March 1944, on the frozen Ukrainian steppe, Red Army soldier Dmitry Sokolov lay bleeding from shrapnel wounds, both legs shattered, left arm broken, unable to stand. A German patrol found him in a shell crater, barely conscious, weapon gone. They assumed he was finished. Dying prisoner, no threat, ready for interrogation. The patrol leader radioed headquarters. Captured wounded Soviet, extracting intelligence, will transport for medical interrogation. 5 German soldiers surrounded Dmitry, confident, relaxed. One offered him water. Another lit a cigarette. They didn't search him carefully. Why would they? He couldn't even move. What they didn't know, beneath Dmitry's torn uniform, pressed against his chest, where German hands hadn't checked, were 2 RGD-33 stick grenades. And despite his wounds, despite the pain, Dmitry's right hand still worked. He'd been waiting, letting Germans gather close, letting them feel safe, letting them believe he was helpless. Then he pulled both pins simultaneously, 3 seconds until detonation. And suddenly, the Germans realized the wounded Soviet wasn't their prisoner, he was their executioner. If you want to know how one dying man took 5 enemies with him, subscribe now. This is the story of the soldier who refused to surrender. Dmitry Sokolov was 23 years old, from a village near Kiev. When Germany invaded in 1941, he'd been a university student studying engineering. By 1942, he was infantry, a rifleman in the 47th Guards Rifle Division. He'd survived Stalingrad, survived the Kursk offensive, survived 2 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. But on March 14, 1944, during a Soviet advance near Uman in Ukraine, his luck ran out. The attack had started at dawn, Soviet infantry pushing west against collapsing German defensive lines. Dmitry's company advanced across open steppe under artillery cover. The Germans counterattacked with armor, 3 Panzer IVs supported by infantry. An 88mm shell exploded 5 meters from Dmitry. The blast threw him 10 meters, shrapnel tearing through both legs and his left arm. He landed in a shell crater, unable to move, bleeding heavily. His rifle was gone, thrown somewhere during the blast. Around him, the battle continued. Soviet forces pushed forward. German forces retreated. The front line moved past his position, leaving Dmitry alone in no man's land. The empty space between opposing armies where wounded soldiers died slowly, forgotten. He tried to crawl. His legs wouldn't respond. Bones shattered, muscles torn. His left arm was broken, useless. Only his right arm functioned. He could barely stay conscious from blood loss and pain. Dmitry knew what came next. Either he'd bleed to death alone, or a German patrol would find him. Both outcomes meant death. The question was how he'd die. He checked his equipment with his working hand. Rifle, gone. Pistol, lost in the blast. But his grenade pouches, 2 RGD-33 stick grenades still secured to his belt. The blast hadn't damaged them. Soviet soldiers were taught, never surrender if you can still fight. Order number 227, not 1 step back, made it clear. Death was preferable to capture. Prisoners brought shame. Heroes died fighting. Dmitry had heard stories. German treatment of Soviet prisoners. Starvation, execution, medical experiments. Even if Germans kept him alive for interrogation, he'd likely die from his wounds anyway in some POW camp. Slow death, helpless, defeated. Or he could choose a different death. He pulled both grenades from their pouches, carefully positioned them against his chest under his torn uniform. The pain made him gasp, but he managed. The grenades were invisible from outside, just another wounded Soviet bleeding in a crater. If Germans found him, and they would, patrols always searched for wounded who might have intelligence. He'd let them approach, let them feel safe, let them gather close. Then he'd pull both pins, 3 seconds until detonation. Close enough that everyone in the crater would die, including him. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't hatred. It was mathematics. 5 German soldiers dead meant 5 fewer shooting at his comrades. His death would have meaning. That was better than dying slowly from wounds or starvation in a prison camp. Dmitri closed his eyes, conserving strength, waiting. The battle sounds faded. Fighting had moved west. Silence settled over the steppe, broken only by distant artillery and wind across frozen ground. Then, voices, German voices, a patrol approaching his position. Dmitri kept his eyes closed, breathing shallow, playing dead, letting them come closer. Unteroffizier Hans Müller led a 5-man patrol across the battlefield, searching for wounded who might provide intelligence. The front had moved west an hour ago, leaving behind the debris of combat, shell craters, destroyed equipment, bodies. "Check that crater," Müller ordered, pointing to where Dmitri lay. 2 soldiers approached cautiously, rifles ready. Soviet wounded sometimes had weapons, sometimes played dead, then attacked. Standard procedure: approach carefully, confirm status, search for intelligence documents. Gefreiter Ernst Schmidt reached the crater first, looked down at Dmitri. Soviet. Badly wounded. Looks dead. "Check him," Müller ordered. Schmidt slid into the crater, kept his rifle pointed at Dmitri while checking for pulse. Found it. Weak, but present. Alive, barely. Shrapnel wounds, both legs, left arm. Massive blood loss. Dmitri remained motionless, eyes closed, breathing shallow. The German's hands patted his legs, his arms, checking for weapons. Touched his uniform jacket briefly, but didn't thoroughly search his chest. The soldier saw blood, torn fabric, and assumed checking a dying man's chest was unnecessary. "Any weapons?" Müller called down. "No rifle, no pistol. He's harmless." Müller relaxed. "Bring him up. We'll interrogate him, see if he knows anything useful about Soviet positions." 2 more soldiers entered the crater to help lift Dmitri. They grabbed his arms. He screamed in pain as they touched his broken left arm. They apologized reflexively, adjusted their grip, tried to be gentler. Even enemies received basic human decency when they were dying. "Easy," one soldier said in broken Russian. "We help you. Medical." Dmitri opened his eyes, looked at the Germans surrounding him. 5 men, all within 3 meters. Perfect, but not yet. They were still cautious, spread slightly apart. He needed them closer, more relaxed, bunched together. "Water," Dmitri whispered in Russian. Schmidt understood. He unslung his canteen, knelt beside Dmitri, lifted his head, offered water. Dmitri drank, genuinely thirsty, and it gave him time. The other soldiers moved closer, watching. Müller lit a cigarette, offered it to Dmitri. "You want? Smoke?" Dmitri shook his head weakly, kept his right hand pressed against his chest, fingers touching the grenade pins beneath his uniform. The Germans saw a dying man clutching his wounds. They didn't see the weapons. "What unit?" Müller asked in German, then gestured, trying to communicate despite language barrier. "Your unit? Regiment?" Dmitri mumbled incoherently. Let them lean closer to hear. All 5 Germans were now in the crater, gathered around him, close, within blast radius. They'd stopped treating him as a threat, just a wounded enemy who might provide intelligence before dying. One soldier started searching Dmitri's uniform pockets for documents. His hands moved across Dmitri's chest, felt something hard beneath the fabric. Paused. "What?" Dmitri's right hand moved fast, faster than a man with his injuries should be able to move. Years of training, muscle memory, adrenaline overcoming pain. He grabbed both grenade pins and pulled. The metallic ping of pins releasing was unmistakable. Every soldier in the crater recognized that sound instantly. "Grenade!" Schmidt screamed. 3 seconds until detonation. The Germans tried to scatter, too late, too close, too slow. Dmitri smiled, not from hatred, not from joy, just satisfaction. His death would mean something. He closed his eyes and waited for the blast. The Germans scrambled. Schmidt tried to climb out of the crater. His boots slipped on frozen mud. Muller reached for his rifle, pure instinct, as if shooting could stop a grenade. The other 3 soldiers dove away from Dmitri, trying to create distance that didn't exist in the confined crater. Dmitri kept his right hand pressed against his chest, holding both grenades tight against his body. The fuses burned inside, 4-second delay mechanisms, already halfway gone. He thought about his mother, hoped she'd believe he died fighting, not captured. Hoped she'd never know he'd been wounded, helpless, reduced to this final desperate act. Second 2. Schmidt was halfway out of the crater when his foot caught on debris. He fell backward, landing among the other Germans. All 5 were now tangled together at the bottom of the crater, exactly where Dmitri had wanted them. One soldier, the youngest, maybe 19, was crying. Not from cowardice, but from the absolute certainty of death in 3, 2, 1. Muller stopped trying to escape. In that final second, he understood the tactical brilliance. The wounded Soviet had deliberately waited, gathered them close, chosen his moment perfectly. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated sacrifice. Scheiße, Muller whispered. Second 3. Dmitri's final thought wasn't about death or pain or even victory. It was simpler. This matters. My death matters. Then the world became fire. The 2 RGD-33 grenades detonated simultaneously. Each contained 120 grams of TNT. Combined blast in a confined crater was catastrophic. The explosion created a pressure wave that traveled at 8,000 meters per second, faster than the human nervous system could process. The 5 Germans died before their brains could register pain. Shrapnel from the grenades and from debris in the crater, metal fragments, rocks, frozen earth, became projectiles traveling at supersonic velocity. The blast wave reached the surface, throwing dirt and smoke 15 meters into the air. Soviet soldiers 400 meters away heard the explosion, saw the column of debris, understood what it meant. Someone had used grenades at point-blank range, probably a wounded soldier making a final stand. German positions 300 meters west heard it too. They waited for their patrol to report. Silence on the radio. They sent another patrol to investigate. The second German patrol found the crater 20 minutes later. What they discovered made them radio immediately for stretchers, not for wounded, but for body bags. The 5-man patrol was dead. All killed by grenade blast and shrapnel at close range. 3 were identifiable. 2 were less so. The blast at such close proximity had been devastating. And at the center of the crater, the remains of a Soviet soldier, still clutching 2 grenade handles. His uniform was mostly gone, his body torn by the same blast that had killed the Germans. The German lieutenant commanding the second patrol looked at the scene and understood immediately what had happened. The Soviet had pulled the pins while Germans were close, deliberately killed himself to take them with him. "Brave bastard," the lieutenant said quietly. His men looked at him in shock, calling an enemy brave. But the lieutenant had fought on the Eastern Front for 2 years. He'd seen Soviet soldiers do insane things. This wasn't insane. This was tactical. He was wounded, outnumbered, unarmed, the lieutenant continued. He used the only weapon he had left, himself. We'd have done the same. One of his soldiers disagreed. We'd have surrendered, lived to fight another day. No, the lieutenant said. Soviets don't surrender, not anymore. We taught them that in 1941 and 1942. Now they fight to the death because they've seen what happens to prisoners. This is what we created. They buried the 6 bodies, 5 Germans and 1 Soviet, in a mass grave near the crater. Standard battlefield burial, no ceremony, just tags removed for identification and notification to families. Dmitry Sokolov's death was recorded as killed in action. His mother received notification 2 months later. Your son died heroically defending the motherland. No details about how, just the standard letter. She never knew he died in a crater, wounded and helpless, choosing to become a weapon rather than a prisoner. Dmitry's final act wasn't unique. Across the Eastern Front in 1944, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. Soviet soldiers, wounded, captured, or surrounded, used grenades as final weapons, taking German soldiers with them in death. German after-action reports from March to May 1944 documented at least 47 incidents of Soviet soldiers detonating grenades while in German custody or during capture attempts. Conservative estimates: 200-plus German casualties from these suicide attacks. The pattern was consistent. Wounded Soviet soldier, apparently helpless, captured by German patrol. During search or transport, the Soviet detonates hidden grenades, killing captors and himself. German command issued new directives. Exercise extreme caution when capturing wounded enemy soldiers. Assume all Soviet wounded are armed and willing to use suicide tactics. Search thoroughly before approaching. Maintain distance when possible. But these directives created their own problems. How do you search a man who can barely move without getting close? How do you transport wounded prisoners while maintaining safe distance? The answer many German soldiers reached: don't take wounded prisoners. Soviet intelligence noticed a grim trend in spring 1944. Wounded Soviet soldiers were increasingly being executed by German patrols rather than captured. German combat reports confirmed it. Wounded enemy combatants neutralized on sight became common phrasing. This was exactly what Soviet command wanted. Order number 227, not one step back, had emphasized: never surrender, fight to the death, make the enemy pay for every meter. Wounded soldiers using suicide tactics embodied that order perfectly. The psychological impact on German soldiers was significant. Every wounded Soviet became a potential threat. That dying man in the crater might be harmless, or might be clutching grenades, waiting for you to come close enough. German soldiers became paranoid about Soviet wounded. They approached cautiously, searched thoroughly, kept maximum distance. This slowed battlefield operations, time spent carefully clearing areas that previously would have been swept quickly. More importantly, it reinforced the Eastern Front's brutal dynamic. No mercy, no quarter, no surrender. Both sides fought with the understanding that capture often meant death anyway. Might as well die fighting, taking enemies with you. By summer 1944, Soviet military newspapers were publishing stories about soldiers who'd used this tactic. Not naming names, security reasons, but praising heroic wounded soldiers who destroyed fascist enemies in their final moments. The stories served as both inspiration and instruction. If you're wounded and surrounded, you still have weapons. Use them. German soldiers read captured Soviet newspapers, understood that suicide tactics were being officially encouraged. The war became even more vicious, if that was possible on the Eastern Front, where viciousness was already the norm. Dmitry Sokolov was one of thousands who chose this final stand. His individual death mattered little in the vast scale of the Eastern Front. But collectively, these suicide attacks changed how both armies fought, made the war even more brutal, eliminated any possibility of mercy between enemies who'd already shown each other none. The Eastern Front's no-surrender culture came at an immense human cost. Soviet casualty rates were staggering. An estimated 11 million military deaths between 1941 and 1945, compared to approximately 5 million German military deaths. Part of this disparity came from Soviet tactical doctrine that prioritized achieving objectives over preserving lives. Part came from Stalin's order number, 227, which made retreat punishable by execution and encouraged soldiers to fight to the death rather than surrender. And part came from the brutal reality both sides had created. Prisoners on the Eastern Front rarely survived. Germans executed Soviet political officers, Jews, and commissars on sight, sent millions of Soviet POWs to concentration camps or forced labor where they died from starvation, disease, and abuse. Soviets, in turn, executed German prisoners or sent them to Siberian labor camps with mortality rates exceeding 30%. Both sides had incentive to fight to the death. Capture was often a delayed death sentence anyway. Tactics like Dmitri's, using grenades to kill captors and yourself, fit this brutal logic. If you're going to die anyway, better to die taking enemies with you. Your death has tactical value. Your family receives notification of heroic death rather than shameful capture. But this logic had costs beyond casualty statistics. It destroyed any possibility of mercy, of humanity between enemies. German soldiers stopped taking wounded Soviet prisoners because too many had used suicide tactics. Soviet soldiers stopped surrendering even when tactically sensible because they'd been taught death was preferable to capture. The war became total, absolute, annihilative. Not just armies fighting armies, but two ideologies trying to exterminate each other. Every soldier on both sides understood. This wasn't war for territory or resources. This was existential combat. Lose, and your entire nation might be destroyed. German soldiers captured in 1944-45 faced this reality. They'd spent 3 years treating Soviet prisoners with systematic brutality. Now, as the Red Army advanced westward, German soldiers knew what revenge might await them. Many fought with desperate ferocity, knowing surrender meant likely death in Soviet captivity. This created a feedback loop of brutality. Germans treated Soviet prisoners harshly, so Soviets treated German prisoners harshly, so Germans fought harder to avoid capture, so Soviets adopted tactics like order number 227 to prevent their soldiers from surrendering, so more soldiers used suicide tactics, so Germans stopped taking prisoners, so the cycle continued. By 1944, the Eastern Front had descended into warfare that resembled nothing else in World War II. The Western Front, where Americans and British fought Germans, had rules, conventions, some degree of mutual respect between professional soldiers. POWs were generally treated according to Geneva Conventions. Surrender was tactically acceptable. But the Eastern Front? No rules, no mercy, no surrender. Just total war prosecuted with absolute brutality on both sides. Dmitry Sokolov's death was one tiny piece of this larger horror. He chose to kill 5 Germans with his final act. From Soviet perspective, heroic sacrifice, tactical effectiveness, embodiment of not one step back. From German perspective, confirmation that Soviet wounded couldn't be trusted, justification for shooting wounded enemies rather than capturing them, proof that the war against the Soviet Union was existential and total. From human perspective, a 23-year-old engineering student died in agony in a frozen crater, killing 5 other young men who'd probably rather have been anywhere else, all because 2 totalitarian empires had decided their ideological conflict justified any level of brutality. That's the truth neither side wanted to acknowledge. But it was the truth nonetheless. March 14th, 1944. 6 men died in a shell crater near Uman, Ukraine. Their deaths were recorded in official reports, families were notified, and the war continued. Within weeks, thousands more would die in similar ways. The Eastern Front consumed lives so rapidly that individual deaths became statistics, numbers in casualty reports. Dmitry Sokolov's mother, Anna, received notification in May 1944. The letter was standard. Your son, Guards, Private Dmitry Mikhailovich Sokolov, died heroically while defending the motherland against fascist invaders. He fulfilled his duty with honor. The motherland will not forget his sacrifice. Anna kept that letter until her death in 1963. She never knew the details, that Dmitry had been wounded, captured, and had chosen to detonate grenades rather than become a prisoner. She believed he'd died in combat, rifle in hand, fighting advancing Germans. That belief gave her comfort. The 5 German families received similar notifications. Unteroffizier Hans Müller's wife learned her husband had been killed in action during combat operations in Ukraine. No details about grenades or suicide attacks. Just the standard death notification that millions of German families received during the war. None of the families, Soviet or German, ever knew their sons and husbands had died together in the same crater, killed by the same explosion, buried in the same mass grave. After the war, Soviet authorities compiled records of soldiers who'd performed heroic final acts, using suicide tactics to kill German soldiers. These records remained classified for decades. The Soviet government wanted to honor sacrifice, but didn't want to explicitly acknowledge that suicide attacks had been tactical doctrine. Dmitri's name appeared in these classified files with a brief entry. Sokolov, D.M., Guards Rifle Division 47, March 1944, near Uman. Used grenades against German captors, killing 5 enemy soldiers. Posthumous recommendation for Order of the Red Banner. But the recommendation was never approved. Not because Dmitri's act wasn't heroic by Soviet standards, but because officially recognizing suicide tactics created complications. What if soldiers started using grenades recklessly? What if they killed themselves when they could have provided intelligence? The doctrine of fighting to the death was encouraged, but individual acts weren't always celebrated. So Dmitri remained a footnote in classified files. His mother received no medal to display, no official recognition beyond the standard death notification, just a name in archives that wouldn't be opened for 50 years. The 5 German soldiers who died with Dmitri were buried in the mass grave near the crater, later reinterred in a German military cemetery established after the war. Their graves have markers with names and dates. Families can visit, leave flowers, remember. Dmitri's grave location is unknown. Mass battlefield burials meant Soviet dead were often buried wherever they fell, without markers. After the war, Soviet authorities attempted to identify and rebury soldiers in official military cemeteries, but millions remained in unmarked graves. Dmitri might be in an official cemetery somewhere in Ukraine, or he might still be in that unmarked mass grave near Uman. No one knows. His mother never found his grave. She died not knowing where her son's body lay. This was common on the Eastern Front. An estimated 4 to 5 million Soviet soldiers remain in unmarked graves, bodies never recovered, locations never recorded, families never able to visit. In 1995, 50 years after the war's end, Russian military historians gained access to previously classified NKVD and Soviet Army files. Among thousands of documents about Eastern Front operations, they found the brief entries about soldiers who'd used suicide tactics. One historian, Dr. Pavel Andreev, researched these cases for a book about Soviet combat doctrine. He found approximately 400 documented incidents of Soviet soldiers using grenades against captors between 1942 and 1945. Conservative estimate, 1,500 to 2,000 German casualties from these attacks. But Dr. Andreev's book was never published. The Russian government in the 1990s was trying to normalize relations with Germany. Publishing a book celebrating Soviet soldiers who'd killed German soldiers through suicide attacks seemed counterproductive. The manuscript remained in archives. Dr. Andreev died in 2008. In interviews before his death, he reflected on his research. We want to remember the Great Patriotic War as heroic, glorious, righteous. And it was. The Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany, saved Europe from fascism. But we don't want to remember how brutal it was, how desperate, how soldiers like Sokolov had to choose between dying as prisoners or dying as weapons. That's uncomfortable history, but it's true history. Today, if you visit Uman, Ukraine, you'll find no memorial to the March 14, 1944 incident, no marker for the crater where 6 men died, The battlefield has been reclaimed by farmland. Wheat grows where Dmitri bled and died. There's a General Soviet War Memorial in Uman honoring all Red Army soldiers who died liberating the city. Dmitri's name isn't on it. Too many soldiers died, not enough space for individual names. The German military cemetery where the 5 German soldiers are buried is maintained by the German War Graves Commission. Families can visit. The graves are marked, documented, remembered. This asymmetry reflects broader patterns. German soldiers who died on the Eastern Front have graves, records, memorials. Millions of Soviet soldiers do not. They disappeared into mass graves, unmarked burial pits, archives that remained classified for decades. Not because the Soviet Union didn't honor its dead, it did, extensively, but because the scale of death was so massive that individual commemoration became impossible. 11 million Soviet military deaths, plus 15 to 20 million Soviet civilian deaths. The sheer magnitude overwhelmed any attempt at personal remembrance. Here's the truth about Dmitri Sokolov. He wasn't exceptionally brave or exceptionally brutal. He was an ordinary soldier who made an extraordinary choice in impossible circumstances. Wounded, bleeding, facing capture and likely death in a prison camp, he chose to die on his own terms and take his enemies with him. Was it heroic? By Soviet doctrine, yes. By human standards, it was desperate, brutal, and tragic. 6 young men died in a crater because 2 totalitarian empires had convinced their soldiers that death was preferable to capture, that mercy was weakness, that the only victory was total annihilation of the enemy. If this story made you think differently about the Eastern Front's brutality, hit subscribe. Drop a comment about war's impossible choices. When there are no good options, only less terrible ones. Share this so Dmitri Sokolov and the millions like him are remembered. So soldiers who died in unmarked graves aren't completely forgotten. The Germans thought they'd captured a helpless prisoner. Dmitri proved he was anything but helpless. In his final 3 seconds of life, he killed 5 enemy soldiers. That's not glory, it's desperation weaponized. But in 1944 on the Eastern Front, desperation was the only weapon millions of soldiers had left. Remember, war creates situations where young men choose to die rather than surrender, where killing your captors and yourself becomes tactically rational, where the line between heroism and horror becomes impossible to distinguish. Dmitri Sokolov, 23 years old, engineering student, dead in a Ukrainian crater with 2 grenades and 5 German soldiers. No marked grave, no memorial, just a brief entry in classified files that were opened 50 years too late for anyone to remember him personally. He's one of millions who died on the Eastern Front, soldiers whose individual deaths vanished into the vast statistical horror of history's most brutal campaign. But his choice, repeated by hundreds of others, shaped how that war was fought, made it more vicious, more total, more absolute. That's worth remembering, not to glorify, but to understand what war does to human beings when it strips away every option except death. They thought he was helpless. He had 3 seconds left. That was enough.